I was working as a licensed representative with Janus mutual funds. But I realized at one point I was talking to one of the investors, and I was talking to the investor, but I was looking out the window, and in my mind, my mind sort of wandered off, and I remembered being on a field trip just like 3 years before with my old friend, may he rest in peace, Bob Goldhammer. And we were in northern Mexico. And my mind wandered there, and I thought, wow, I really miss that. I missed geology. The finance was fine. It was interesting, but I considered it, and I thought, no, that's what I want to do. My name is Ramón Treviño. I'm a program manager here at the Bureau of Economic Geology for the Gulf Coast Carbon Center, which does research on carbon dioxide sequestration. And I've been at the Bureau and at the University of Texas since 1995, almost 30 years. I went to the university in my hometown, Kingsville, Texas, which at the time was Texas A&I University. And after a year or so taking biology, having biology as a major, I ran into an acquaintance from high school. So I was talking to him, and I said, Rick, what are you studying? And he said he was going to be a natural gas engineer. And I said, wow, what's that? So he told me what it was, and engineering, and I said, well, I don't really do really great in math. And he said, well, you could be a geologist. That is literally how I decided to look into geology. And I did, and fell in love with it. From down there, the closest rocks we had weren't even in the hill country. They were in Mexico. So we would go on field trips, over a weekend, and we would go into the mountains in northern Mexico. And it was fantastic. I mean, world-class geology down there. So I fell in love with it, And my plan was go and work for an oil and gas company, which I eventually did. But it took some time. The 1980s were tough times for the oil and gas industry. There was a major drop in the price of oil in like 1982, and there were significant layoffs throughout the industry. When I got my master's degree, or when I was getting my master's degree, there was another major downturn in the oil price.
The price of oil has fallen from the $36 a barrel of 1981 to about $12 a barrel today.
Mobile especially would come in and recruit on campus. But eventually, as the spring wore on, they decided to cancel all the summer internships. But they sent me a stipend for the summer. And they said, here, we're sorry we couldn't hire you, but here's more than $1,000. I remember that, which in 1986 was a lot of money for a student. And so I sent them a letter, and I said, thank you. I appreciate it. I understand what's going on. Please remember me in the future. They didn't even come to interview the next year. But I wrote them a letter, and I said, remember me, et cetera. There were 3 of us that they hired that year in that office. And we were going with the HR person in the elevator. And he turned to us and he said, we gave a lot of stipends to people. And he said, you 3 guys were among the few who sent us a thank you. So I ended up working for Mobil. That was the beginning of my professional career. I worked there for 4 years until another big downturn in the oil price ended up closing the office, and I got laid off. So I was kind of looking around, okay, what am I going to do? It was hard to find a job. And so I thought, well, I know how to go to school. I'd done it. And so I applied for the University of Oklahoma. And I thought, okay, I'm going to do something totally different. At the time, the MBA in general, was considered, this is like a ticket to, success. It was totally different from science. So it kind of, and during my undergraduate and master's career in geology, I had no training in finances or management or anything like that. So it was, in many ways, it was difficult at the time, but it was an incredible opportunity that, expanded my horizons. So I hadn't really thought, okay, once I get done, what industry do I want to go into? And I kind of looked at different ones, but never felt really interested in any of them enough. Thought, well, I am a geologist. So I started interviewing for geological positions and actually received an offer. And then there was a peso devaluation crisis in Mexico.
Mexico's economic crisis deepened today with stocks dropping sharply and the peso still under fire.
So they told me, well, sorry, we can't hire you after all. So there I was, kind of stuck. I'd sold my house in Oklahoma City. My stuff was stored in my friend's parents' garage. And I thought, okay, now what am I going to do? Well, I had a friend who lived in Austin at the time. And I said, George, I don't know, what I'm going to do now. And he said, well, what are you doing up there anyway? Come down to Austin. It's a lot better place to live anyway.
Austin, Texas, a dynamic city long known for its quality of life and scenic beauty, is today the fastest growing metropolis in the South and Southwest United States.
He said, I've got a duplex. Come over here. You can stay there. So I did. And I joined the Austin Geological Society. And there were a lot of people still, geoscientists who were without jobs at the time. I remember talking to somebody at one of those meetings, and the guy said, well, hey, have you thought about the Bureau? And I thought, wow, I hadn't. So I came to the Bureau, and I applied. They were looking for a geologist who had oil and gas experience, but they also needed somebody who could speak Spanish, because they were going to bring up half a dozen geologists and engineers from Argentina, and most of them did not speak English. And I said, well, I speak Spanish, and I speak it well. I grew up speaking Spanish in Kingsville. And so there I was back doing geology, and I was like, yeah, this is what I really like. So it was great. That's how I got into the Bureau to begin with. And then there was Sue Havorka had just gotten her first grant for carbon storage, carbon sequestration at the time. And so she said, I've got enough funding for you for like a couple of months. So I worked for Sue for a couple of months, which was really great. Scott Tinker was the new director at the time. And they worked really hard to get some funding from the state, which eventually became STAR. So I worked as a geologist, and also seismic interpreter to some degree. And I'd been doing that now at that point for about 7 years. And I was starting to feel like, I really want to do a little something different, But I couldn't put my finger on it, And one day I was walking out the door, going down the stairs, and Sue and I were walking out there together. And I said, hey, Sue, how's it going, She goes, oh, it's going well. She goes, but now, I need a project manager. And she started listing the things that she needed in a project manager. And I was listening to her as we went down the stairwell, and I was thinking to myself, wow, that sounds like me. And I couldn't shake the thought. I thought, wow, that was interesting. So like a day or so later, I reached out to her. I said, hey, Sue, remember what you told me the other day? And I said, yeah, I've got to say, honestly, that sounded like me. And she goes, it is you. The directors had told her, you are not allowed to talk to him. He has a job here. You're not allowed to talk to him. But she said, you talked to me about it. Now that rule is off. She did say at the time, she says, you'll be able to work 50% as a geologist and 50% as a manager. And I thought, well, that's great. I can dust off my management skills and, et cetera. And that ended up not being true because the first project was huge, really, really big. It was a Cranfield project. It was basically a baptism by fire. It was like a $30-some million project. And here I was, I'd never managed anything before. So basically my career took a big change. And I've been doing that now for 18 and a half years as a project manager within the Gulf Coast Carbon Center. The university is not set up for operations, for field operations. And so it's difficult within the university when you're doing something like drilling deep wells, especially in another state, to be able to manage all the subcontractors that you need. And we also had a lot of science partners, several of the national laboratories. So we had to work with them, and we had to manage how we would do that with them. We had to manage the funding to other subrecipients who were also putting experiments onto part of what we were doing there, to monitor. So at that time, we were throwing everything at the kitchen sink at Cranfield. So it was difficult. It was not easy, but it was very successful. And I don't know how many dozens of peer-reviewed papers came out of that study. It's world famous, quite honestly. We ended up buying a high-resolution 3D seismic acquisition system. We had to get our system across the country on a train, pick up some extra equipment in San Jose, California, get our equipment onto a ship leaving from the port of Oakland, and coming to Japan. I mean, that all sounds so easy, but it is really difficult to do when you don't do this every day. We were able to do it, and there were tight deadlines because we had to, in Japan, they were also doing an offshore injection. So we had to get there just in time, to be able to acquire this high-resolution 3D. So once again, that was, very challenging, but very rewarding because we ended up getting a lot of great data out of that, incredible high-resolution 3D seismic data, and a lot of publications out of it too. Going into geoscience it's just been an incredible thing for me. It was like little turns here and there. I don't want to say I stumbled into it, but in some ways, it was just, I took a turn here, I took a turn there, and it's been incredible. Getting an education is something people can never take away from you. Geoscience is so broad. If you go and get an undergraduate, you'll get a really broad general science education that can be used in so many different ways. There's so many new fields that are going to require geoscientists in the future for the good of our civilization. I mean, I went into working with Sue and Tip and the rest of my colleagues at GCCC because I thought working on CO2 sequestration was really important as an option for the climate crisis that we're living through now. But there's also geothermal energy is coming on strong, and they're going to need geologists, geophysicists. Critical minerals, are really, really important. Most of the devices we walk around with need so many of these critical minerals, and finding them is going to take geoscientists to do that. I mean, for a young person today, gosh, the sky's the limit, including planetary geology. So.
Thanks for watching Meet a Geoscientist, a series by the Bureau of Economic Geology. For more information on this topic, check out the links in the description below. If you enjoyed this conversation, like and subscribe to discover more career paths in geoscience.